She was certain she would die in that trap, abandoned in the middle of the forest, until a lonely farmer decided to risk his own life for an orc he had never met. And he had no idea what that choice would cost him. She was certain she would die there. Not from the cold, not from hunger, but from the iron jaws crushing her leg into the frozen ground, patient like something that had been waiting for her. Yenra pressed her back against the bark of a fallen pine and stared at the sky through the gaps in the branches. The clouds moved fast, gray and heavy, the kind of sky that comes before a long snow. She had not screamed. Screaming drew attention, and attention in these mountains meant hunters, and not the kind that chased deer. The trap had snapped shut 3 days ago. She had dragged herself far enough to lean against the trunk, hauling the chain behind her like a broken wing, and her leg throbbed with a low, constant heat that told her the wound was doing what wounds do when left too long without care. She thought about her clan, about the mountains further north, where old Magra would be preparing the fires for the cold season. She had chosen to walk alone, convinced that traveling without the others would keep them safe. No trail, no witnesses, no reason to follow. She had been wrong. The trap was old iron, the kind set for bears, placed on a track used only by people who knew the forest well enough to avoid the main roads. That was not an accident. Yenra closed her amber eyes and breathed slowly and counted the sounds. Wind through the pines, the distant crack of a branch under the weight of ice, a bird somewhere to the west that had not yet left for warmer land. Then, something else. Footsteps. Deliberate. Heavy enough to belong to a man, slow enough to belong to someone paying attention. If this story finds you somewhere warm tonight, do one small thing for me. Write in the comments which town the winter finds you in. Now, back to the trap in the pines. She pulled the black stone dagger from her belt with a hand that trembled more from exhaustion than fear. The blade was carved from volcanic obsidian, its surface marked with the symbols of her clan's oldest lineage. Her grandmother had given it to her the morning she first left alone. "You are not fragile," the old woman had said, "but neither is stone." The footsteps stopped, then a voice, low and careful, as if the person on the other side already understood that speaking too loudly here would be a mistake. "Hello," one word. A human accent, rough from the mountains. Yenra pressed herself tighter against the bark and raised the dagger. A man came around the edge of the fallen trunk, tall, broad-shouldered, a coat the color of dried mud, brown eyes that moved across the scene with a kind of calm that did not belong to someone who had come looking for trouble. He carried a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. He looked at her leg, then at the trap, then at her face, and he did not move. She watched his eyes. 20 years of living near the boundary between orc territory and human land had taught her that the first 3 seconds of a man's expression told his whole story. Fear usually looked like disgust. Greed looked like calculation. Pity looked like condescension. This man looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they are already trying to solve. She tightened her grip on the dagger anyway. He crouched slowly, making himself smaller, keeping his hands where she could see them. "I am not going to hurt you," he said quietly. Yenra did not understand every word, but she understood the tone, and she understood that he had not raised the rifle. He pointed slowly at the trap, then at his own hands, and mimed pulling the iron jaws apart. She watched him a long moment. Then, dagger still raised, she gave the smallest nod. He set the rifle on the ground first, where she could see it, then crouched beside the trap and pressed down on the heavy springs with the full weight of his arms, forcing the jaws open an inch at a time. When they finally separated, she pulled her leg back and pressed herself against the trunk, dagger pointed at his chest. He sat back on his heels and raised both hands. He did not reach for the rifle. She did not lower the dagger. The wind moved through the pine tops, carrying the smell of coming snow, and neither of them spoke. For the first time in 3 days, Yenra was not alone. She was not sure yet whether that was better or worse. His name was Cole. He did not say it right away. He stayed in the snow beside the fallen trunk and waited, the way a man waits when he understands that patience is the only honest thing he can offer. He had come into the forest that morning because of the sound, soft and low, barely audible above the wind. He had told himself it was an animal, a deer caught in one of the old iron traps the last owner of his land had scattered through the eastern woods. Cole had been pulling those traps out of the ground for 3 years, one by one, carrying them back to the barn and breaking them apart with a hammer. He hated the things. They did not know the difference between a deer and a child. He had followed the sound for the better part of an hour, reading the trail the way his father had taught him before everything else fell apart. What he found was not a deer. He looked at the trap now, rusted at the hinges but still strong where it mattered. The chain was driven into the ground with an iron stake, deliberate work. Someone had set this recently. The rust was only at the surface. He looked at the woman's leg without letting his expression change. The wound was bad, not fatal if treated, fatal if ignored much longer. She was young, emerald-green skin streaked with mud and sap, black hair tangled from days in the weather, traveling clothes that had once been practical and were now simply destroyed. And despite all of it, there was something in her posture that refused to be reduced, even sitting on frozen ground. She looked like someone who had not yet decided whether she would let this kill her. He had known only a few people like that. His brother Eli had been one. Cole pushed the thought away before it could settle. He had left his old town 5 years ago because grief had made him useless in places where people expected him to be fine. He had come to this mountain land with a little money, a horse, and no plan beyond making the days pass without causing further damage to himself or anyone else. He built the barn first, then the cabin, planted what the soil would accept, and learned the rest by failing at it. Sold horses, traded pelts, spoke to almost no one. 2 days south there was a settlement where orcs and humans traded openly, and some had even married. But up here in the high country it was different. He had heard the language people used when they thought no one was listening. He had never joined in. But he had never said anything against it either. And that was its own kind of failure, and he knew it. He stripped the twigs off a long pine branch and held it out to her, horizontal, not threatening, a walking staff. She looked at it for several seconds. Then she reached out and took it. Her name was Yenra. She said it the way someone says a thing they are not sure the other person deserves to hear. A small offering, conditional. Testing the air. He repeated it carefully and got the first part slightly wrong. She corrected him with a single quiet sound, and he tried again, close enough. The walk to the cabin took nearly an hour, her leg unable to carry her weight, the ground uneven with frost and hidden roots. He had offered a hand once, and she had refused. And he stopped offering. The cabin appeared through the trees as the last daylight went flat and gray, small and functional, logs cut with care but no artistry. The kind of place built by someone who wanted it to last and had no interest in impressing anyone. She stepped inside and went directly to the corner nearest the door, the spot with the clearest view of both the window and the entrance, and lowered herself to the floor with her back against the wall. He did not argue. He built up the fire and set a pot of water on the hook, hung his coat, and leaned his rifle near the hearth, not hidden and not threatening, simply where she could see it. She watched him move through the cabin with the economy of a man who lived alone, everything in its place, used without thought. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles marked from outdoor work. When he leaned to the fire and his shirt pulled across his shoulders, she saw them. Old scars, long raised lines crossing his back in patterns she recognized. The kind that came from a specific violence, the kind that did not happen by accident. She said nothing. He set warm water and a folded cloth near her side of the room, close enough to reach without moving far, then pulled a chair to the opposite wall and sat down. Neither of them slept. She kept the dagger across her knees and watched him through the long hours. She catalogued the way he breathed, the moment his head dipped toward sleep and he caught himself and straightened, and she understood he did not want to startle her by moving in the dark. She cleaned her own wound slowly with the water and cloth, working through the pain. The iron had gone deep on one side. She would need plants from the forest. But not tonight. She also noticed, somewhere around the third hour of dark, that his breathing had a roughness to it. A cough caught and swallowed, and caught again, the sound of too many cold winters in the lungs. She filed it away. Tonight the fire was warm, and the door was close, and her dagger was in her hand, and that was enough. On the second morning she watched him gentle a horse. She had not meant to watch. She had come to the doorway because the cold air was better than the close warmth, and her leg ached less standing. But then she heard the sound from the barn, and found herself still there 10 minutes later. The horse was a young bay with the nervous energy of an animal, not yet decided whether people were worth tolerating. Cole stood in the center of the corral with his arms loose and his voice doing all the work, low and continuous, almost a song without a melody, turning his body a little every time the horse shifted, following its motion without chasing it. No rope, no whip, just patience and voice. After a while the horse slowed and stopped and turned its head to him and stood, watching him the way Yenra had watched him in the corner the night before. He did not go to the horse. He waited. The horse came to him. She turned away before he could look up and see her. In the days after they moved carefully around the space of the cabin, two people learning the rules of a game neither had played. He learned she preferred to eat only after watching him eat first, so he began taking his portion and finishing several bites before sliding the second plate across the floor toward her, unhurried, never looking at her while she decided whether to accept it. She learned he woke before dawn and went straight to the fire, and that he repaired things constantly, that the cabin had the particular order of a person who cannot control the large things and so controls the small ones. She recognized that too. On the fifth evening she found a fledgling bird on the floor by the eastern window, fallen from somewhere above, shaking in her cupped hands. She built a small nest of cloth and dried grass in a wooden bowl and set it near the warmest part of the wall. He said nothing about it. But the next morning she found a small pile of grain on the floor beside the bowl, set out without a word, without asking whether she wanted it. He had simply noticed what was needed and provided it. She sat with her back to the wall a long time that morning, looking at the grain, thinking about what it means when a person's actions are consistently more honest than most people's words. She taught him a word that evening. She pointed at the fire and said it slowly. He repeated it badly. She made a small sound of correction. He tried again, less wrong. Then he pointed at the water bucket and said the word in his own tongue, and she said it back better than he had managed hers, and he raised his eyebrows in exaggerated defeat, and she almost smiled. After that, every object in the cabin had two names: the table, the window, the horses, the mountain through the eastern glass, the stars, when the clouds broke and the night went deep and clear. They sat on the porch some evenings, far enough apart that no one watching would have called it closeness, and named things in each other's languages while the cold moved in across the valley below, and the naming became its own quiet language on top of the two, a third thing that belonged only to them. She told him, in her own tongue, things she had not said aloud to anyone, about the months of running, about the men who had begun appearing at the edges of orc territory with pieces of paper and coin for anyone who could locate a member of the old clans. He did not understand the words, but he sat still and he listened, and that was its own kind of comprehension, and she had not spoken this freely in over a year. The night his brother's name came out of his mouth was the night she understood that he too carried something heavy and silent and years old. He told her slowly, stopping often, finding words she would know, or drawing shapes when the words failed. A younger brother, a debt, an injustice, with no one left to correct it. Eli, she listened the way he had listened to her, and when he finished, the fire down to coals, she said one word in her clan's tongue, the word for I hear you. He did not know it. But when she said it, he closed his eyes a moment, like someone who had finally set something down. She told him about the bounty on the 14th mark he had scratched into the cabin wall, one for each day. They were sitting across the table from each other for the first time, the chair having moved from the floor and closer by small degrees neither of them acknowledged, both of them holding cups. She told him in a mix of both tongues, filling the gaps with her hands and shapes drawn on the wood. She showed him the scar on her forearm where one of them had come close last spring. Certain families in the southern cities, she told him, families that had profited from the old wars and did not profit from the peace, were paying for the capture of orcs from the ancient clans. Not all orcs, specifically the ones whose bloodlines gave them a claim to land taken during the war, the same war that had burned the plains to the west and hollowed out half the northern holds a generation back. If those orcs vanished quietly, the claims vanished with them. She was one of those orcs. Her grandmother's line ran back to the holds that had signed the old peace, and that made her worth coin to men who wanted the peace undone. He looked angry, not at her, at the specific kind of cruelty that dresses itself in paperwork and bounty posters. He asked, through gesture and shared words, whether she thought they had followed her here. She did not know. She had been careful. But injured people leave better trails. He was quiet a long time after that. Then he pushed back his chair and looked out at the valley the way men do when they are deciding something, and when he turned back his face was settled. He pointed at the floor of the cabin. His meaning was plain. She stayed here. He stayed here. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. She wanted to tell him how much that cost, how rare it was, how many people had disappeared from her life because the price of standing beside her became too visible. Instead, she said his name, and when he looked at her, she took the small green feather from the leather band at her wrist and reached across the table and tucked it into the brim of his hat, which sat between them. He touched the brim lightly. He thought it was a gift, and she let him think that for now. In the old tongue of her clan, it meant something specific. It meant, I give you leave to walk beside me as one I count worthy. She had never given it to anyone outside the clan. She told herself it was gratitude. She sat with that explanation for exactly 1 hour before admitting to herself that it was not gratitude, but something she had stopped believing she would feel again. That same evening, the little bird hopped to the edge of the bowl for the first time, testing the air with small, uncertain movements. In the morning, the bowl was empty, and the bird was gone. She went to the window, and there was nothing to see but pines and snow and pale winter sky. but it had flown. She thought about that a long time. The horses told her first. All four stopped eating at the same moment, heads high, ears forward, all pointed at the same trail. She was in the barn doorway when it happened, Cole behind her with a bucket, and she touched his arm without thinking. The first time she had reached for him, and he went still. She pointed. 3 riders on the ridge trail, moving with the deliberate slowness of men who are not in a hurry because they believe they have already won. She knew the shape of the one in front. Heavy shoulders, a dark leather coat, gray at the temples. Harker, she had seen him twice before and disappeared both times before he could be sure. Her leg was better, but not fast. Cole set the bucket down without a sound and said one quiet word, "In," and she shook her head. She pointed at the roof of the barn, then at herself, then at the rifle in his hands. He understood. The riders reached the flat ground before the cabin, and Harker dismounted first, the way men dismount when they expect others to wait for them. Cole walked out to meet them. Yenra moved through the barn to the gap between the wall and the roof beam she had marked on her second day, pulled herself up, and settled flat along the ridge of the roof where she could see everything. Harker held up a paper, a rough drawing of her face, recognizable enough. She watched Cole look at it the way a man looks at something he has never seen. She had not known he could lie so calmly. "Never seen any orc up here," he said. "Live alone." Harker smiled, not because he believed it, but because he did not need to, and pointed at 2 plates drying on a rock beside the door. Cole did not look away. He simply let the conversation move into different country and stayed exactly where he stood. Harker moved closer. She counted the distance. 15 paces. 10. When the second rider began to circle toward the far side of the cabin, Cole stepped into his path, and the rider swung the butt of his rifle, and she heard the impact and saw Cole's knees buckle and felt something cold move through her chest. That was not the mountain air. He did not go all the way down. He caught himself on one knee, blood coming from his hairline, and stayed in the rider's path. She exhaled slowly. She drew. The first arrow crossed the yard in less than a second and punched through Harker's saddle leather, and the horse went sideways, and the calm scene became suddenly something else. She was already drawing the second. It took Harker's hat clean off his head and buried itself in the cabin door behind him. The 3 men froze. They searched the trees, the barn roof, the ridge, the trees again. They could not find her. She counted her remaining arrows and watched Harker's hands, because his hands would tell her his next decision before he made it. Harker left. He rode away slowly, the deliberate slowness of a man communicating that this was a choice and not a retreat. And at the edge of the ridge he turned his head once and looked back at the yard, where Cole was still standing. Then he was gone over the ridge. Yenra stayed on the roof 3 more minutes, until she was certain. Then she came down and crossed the yard faster than her legs should have allowed, and put her hands on either side of Cole's face, and turned his head to see the cut above his hairline. It was bleeding the way head wounds bleed, badly and not as bad as it looked. She had not touched his face before. She became aware of that about 2 seconds after she did it. He did not move. His face was the face of someone staying very carefully still so as not to disturb something. She cleaned the wound and pressed cloth to it, felt his pulse under her fingers at his temple, steadier than she expected from a man who had just taken a rifle butt to the head, and she went in for the herb paste and came back and applied it, and he sat through all of it without complaint. "Even," he said eventually. She looked at him. "You saved my life. I saved yours. We are even." She shook her head and found the words. "Not even," she said, "side by side." That night they sat by the fire and talked a long time about what came next. Harker would return. Men like that ran on a logic of accumulated grievance, and the peace was 50 years old, and some of them had spent every one of those years treating it as a temporary insult. He would come back with more riders and a story about righteous purpose. She told Cole what she had avoided saying for weeks, that staying here meant real danger for him, not the brief sharp kind from that afternoon, but the sustained kind that could take everything he had built. He listened. Then he said, "You should go back to your clan." She had prepared for an argument. The agreement caught her off guard. She looked at the fire. "The men who came today," she said. "Do you understand why they came?" "Yes, and you still." "Yes," she said nothing for a while. Then she reached into her vest and took out the black stone dagger and held it, feeling the weight of it, the carved symbols under her thumb she had traced so many times she could read them in the dark. "My grandmother's hands made these marks," she said slowly. "In my clan, a warrior does not give this to someone they do not trust completely." She set it in his hand. He closed his fingers around it. She went to the door. "I will come back," she said. She did not make it a question. She did not make it a promise. She said it the way you say a fact you are in the process of making true. She walked into the dark, and he stood in the doorway and watched her go until the trees took her. When he finally went inside, the room felt like a different size than it ever had. Not smaller, just different. The way a space feels when it has been shared long enough that it remembers. He made a mark on the wall. 42 marks. He stopped himself from making the 43rd 3 separate times over the days that followed, and he was not sure what that meant, except that he was not ready to close the count. He was mending the fence on the east boundary when the horses stopped, and he heard it before he saw it. The particular silence that falls when 4 animals decide at once to pay attention to the same thing. They came through the pines in a group, riding the unhurried way of people who know the land and are not hiding from it. At the front, on a gray horse, was a woman whose posture carried decades of authority as naturally as breathing. Tall, even mounted. Silver braids to her waist threaded with stone beads and feathers. Her cloak marked at the hem with the symbols he had learned to recognize from the dagger's handle. Mogra, behind her, on a dark horse, recovered and straight-backed. The torn leather replaced with proper traveling clothes in the deep green of her clan was Yenra. She looked at him across the yard and did not smile at once. She studied his face first, the way she always had, reading it for what it actually held before deciding what to offer back. Then, quiet and small, she smiled. He set the fence tool down. The old woman dismounted with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times and walked toward him, and he stood still, because he understood that moving to meet her was not his place in this moment. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes dark and very clear, and asked him something. Yenra translated, "Why did you help her?" He said, "Because nobody should die alone in a trap in the woods. Does not matter what they look like." Mogra listened. She asked another, "What do you want in return?" He said, "Nothing. If she is alive, that is already the whole thing." Several of the riders behind her exchanged looks. The old woman asked a third, and this one took longer, Yenra choosing her words with care. "Do you understand that if you stand beside her, some people will never forgive you for it? There will be more men with papers, more riders on that trail. Do you understand that, and do you choose it anyway?" He said yes before she finished translating. Mogra held his eyes a moment longer. Then she walked past him into the cabin, and he did not follow. She moved through the space they had shared with the quiet attention of someone reading a long document carefully. The bed given to Yenra while he slept in the chair. 2 plates, clean and well kept. The black stone dagger placed carefully beside the hat with the green feather in its brim, both protected like things that mattered. When she came out, she was holding the dagger. She looked at it, and looked at him, and said something to Yenra, and Yenra's face changed in a way he had not seen before. Something unlocking behind the amber eyes. Mogra reached into her own cloak and took out a medallion on a cord, stone, dark, carved with symbols older than anything on the dagger, and placed it in his hands with both of hers around them. The riders lowered their heads a fraction, the particular motion of people acknowledging something real. Yenra came to stand beside him and told him quietly what it meant. Friend of the clan, you will always have a place with us. He looked at the stone in his palm. He had spent 5 years trying to want nothing, to need nothing, to make himself into someone loss could not reach, because there was nothing left to lose. He had built the fence and the barn and the cabin and the careful small routines of a life designed to keep its distance from everything that mattered. He had done all of it, and a sound in the forest had ended it in the better part of an hour. Mogra put her hand briefly on Yenra's shoulder, then mounted, and the riders turned with her and filed back up the trail in the same order they had come, unhurried, the quiet confidence of people with somewhere to be. Yenra's horse remained. She stood beside him, and they watched the riders disappear into the pines, and when the last of them was gone, the yard was very quiet. She said a word, one word in the old tongue, the same word she had spoken weeks ago on the porch, the one he had asked the meaning of and she had said had no translation, and looked away. He repeated it now. The pronunciation was right. All her corrections across all those evenings had finally settled properly into his mouth. She looked at him. I see who you actually are, she said. He said it back to her in her own tongue, the real meaning of it landing in the space between them like something that had been traveling toward this moment for a long time. She stepped forward. He opened his arms. There was no distance left to negotiate, and no caution left to keep. She came to him the way the bay horse had finally crossed the corral that first morning, not because it was forced to, but because it had finished deciding. He held her carefully, and she let herself be held, and above them the peaks were white, and the sky was the particular blue that only comes after a long time of gray. After a while she pulled back and reached up and took the green feather from his hat and pressed it back into the leather band at her wrist where it had lived before. He understood now what it meant, what it had always meant. He lifted the medallion from his palm and looked at her, and she took it and tied it around his neck with the cord, her fingers working the knot thoroughly, making sure it would hold, the way she worked every knot. They stood on the porch a long time after that. The snow on the upper slopes caught the afternoon light and held it the way good things hold light, without trying to do anything with it, just receiving it, just being present in it. Inside, the fire was still going. On the table, 2 cups. On the wall, 42 marks. He would not make a 43rd. He did not need to count anymore. If this story stayed with you, tell me one thing in the comments. When Yenra said not even, side by side, what do you think it cost her to say it out loud? I read every comment. And if you want more tales from the clans and the high country, subscribe, because the hearth here always keeps a cup for you.